Thank you all very much. Thanks for being here today. I want to start by thanking Eric for inviting a chapter in this book on comprehensive sexuality education. It's a topic that is rarely, if ever, mentioned in connection with the earth or with environmental education. It's actually not mentioned nearly enough in the context of education itself. So it's a great opportunity to say something about it and why it's so important, and I'm happy to follow Pamela's talk as well because it's so closely related with social and emotional learning. It's really a part of it, I think. So for those who've been able to watch her talk, this kind of just segues right from it. So this is the way research and writing often works at the Worldwatch Institute. One day I was working away in my office early in the conceptualization of this book, and Eric stopped in my office and started to describe this concept of Earth education for the earth, EarthEd. And I said, you really ought to have a chapter on sex education. And he said, tell me more. So I said some of what I'm going to be saying to you this morning, and he said, good, can you write it? I won't tell you what I said, but the chapter's in the book. And I knew enough about my own lack of full knowledge about this sensitive and complicated topic to summon the United Nations top expert in comprehensive sexuality education, Mona Cadeby, to be the lead author of the report. And I'm grateful for her help on it. So what did I say to interest Eric? Why would one include a chapter on sex education in a book that's basically promoting education to prepare people for an environmentally stressed 21st century? So let me give you a spoiler alert first, in case anybody's wondering. There will be no actual sex education in this talk. So there's no need for an adult content warning. What I'll be doing is just talking about sex education, and specifically a concept that's a little broader than just sex ed, called comprehensive sexuality education. Pamela had a three-letter acronym for social and emotional learning, SEL. I'm going to inflict another acronym on you so I don't have to keep saying this big term, comprehensive sexuality education, and that's CSE for comprehensive sexuality education. Mona and I argue that it really touches on and relates to every layer of the core principles of Earth education, that pyramid that Eric had on the screen for his talk. And that in particular it relates to the life skills line, if you recall that line that crept up the side of the pyramid and really relates to everything that is shown there. That's what we're talking about. It's got a bit of history to it. I'm older than probably most of you here in the room and most of you listening online, but I had a sex ed course. It lasted one evening in high school. I went to high school in the 1960s, and I remember it vividly. It was a room full. It was in the evening, and the fathers were asked to bring their sons. Sons were told to bring their fathers for a lecture in a room like this. All I remember about the lecture, actually, this was just one evening of all my sex education, at least in school. All I remember was that we learned that if we ever felt ourselves to be sexually aroused, we should take a cold shower. And what I also remember about the night was that there was no eye contact that anybody had with anyone. And when I went home, sure enough, I had no eye contact with my father, and we didn't talk about it at all. It goes back even further than that. I just discovered recently, I was reading a book about language and the proliferation of languages around the world, and this author was writing about the importance of teaching foreign languages in school, and he said, you know, the sad thing is that money is being taken out of foreign language education. It's put into all kind of fadistic things, he called them, such as courses on romance and marriage, AKA sex education, and I don't know why this was sort of random, garbage disposal, he said. And I looked at the copyright. This book was written in 1952. Well, I would argue actually that waste, what to do with waste, is an important part of Earth education, and I would definitely add that sex education is part of it. But even in the early 50s, this was a controversial idea. There's a wide diversity of kinds of sexuality education, from abstinence only, which probably you've heard a lot about and are familiar with, to family life education, which implies that sexuality is really about forming families, and there's not much of another purpose for it. And then what we tend to call sort of basic CSE and enhanced CSE, and there's a kind of an essential definition of what comprehensive sexuality education, which is age-appropriate, culturally relevant approach to teaching about sexuality and relationships by providing scientifically accurate, realistic and non-judgmental information. So key words there are age-appropriate, scientifically accurate, non-judgmental, and that's the way we should be thinking about these. This is not so much about teaching young people what sex is, although that's part of a good full K through 12 and on into university CSE curriculum, obviously. But it's really about the full complement of what sexuality is in every human being and how it connects to their relationships with other human beings. So as young people who take CSE courses often themselves say, sexuality is who we are. It's not really what we do. We experience sexuality with a diversity of expression encompassing sexual orientation, intimacy, pleasure, love, and reproduction. And no safe, intentional, and harm-free variation of sexuality is really inherently bad or immoral or abnormal. It's simply an integral, if sometimes challenging or troublesome, aspect of each person's being, and is properly addressed that way. So to approach sexuality education with those kinds of principles and these definitions in mind is also to teach fundamental values of tolerance and compassion, respect for the human dignity of every human being, the essential dignity of every human being. And these are values, as Pamela spoke about, that will serve humanity well, we argue, as the environment becomes more stressed and as people find the need to become more resilient in the face of a changing environment, as well as to do what they can to mitigate the changes that are occurring. And this leads to the broader or enhanced definition of CSE that's increasingly becoming popular, promoted by UN agencies like UNESCO, United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, which is thinking more about the idea of human rights and the connection of human rights to sexuality, gender focus, looking at how gender and our treatment of gender in societies affects and is affected by our understanding and the education we receive on sexuality. It's an approach that empowers people to take control of their own behavior, treat others with respect, acceptance, tolerance, and empathy, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, race, or sexual orientation. It looks a lot like what Pamela was talking about. Now, these clearly are skills that encourage critical thinking, decision-making, and assertiveness. These are all things, as Pamela said, that we need very much for the century ahead. And they're skills that contribute to healthier relationship with family members, with friends, with peers, with romantic and sexual partners, and for that matter, with strangers, with new arrivals in our communities, which is very much an issue all over the world today. And interestingly, although this second, fuller, more expanded version of comprehensive sexuality education spends a little less time and is less focused on how to prevent sexually transmitted infections and how to prevent unintended pregnancy, the studies that have been done about the results of this broader kind of CSE indicate that it's actually more effective in preventing sexually transmitted infection and disease and unintended pregnancies than courses that simply teach kids this sort of preventive approach, which some people today in CSE see as sort of negative in contrast to a more positive approach to teaching about sexuality. So how does all this relate to the Earth? What does this have to do with EarthEd? And we argue that there are two actually different pathways that complement each other, that operate on different time scales, but both contribute uniquely to mitigation and adaptation, so essentially prevention of environmental stress and resilience in the face of environmental stress and attending social stress. And one of these is a long-term influence, and it involves the sensitive topic of population. And I don't think it takes too much to understand what the connection is. Based on significant evidence, CSE has been studied for decades in multiple countries in terms of its outcomes. Exposure to CSE, the more the better the course the better, delays the initiation of sexual activity and reduces teen pregnancy, as well as reducing unintended pregnancy throughout life. So it doesn't take much to see that when there is also access to a range of reproductive health services, including family planning, with safe and effective contraception and good information on how to use it, CSE reduces birth rates throughout the population, abortion rates too, for that matter, which is a good thing, and hence it slows population growth. The more and the better comprehensive sexuality education there is, the sooner the world's population will stop growing and begin gradually to decline. And we can argue about this, but I think probably most people would agree that overall that's likely to reduce stress on natural and environmental resources and arguably on social stresses as well. So that's a good thing. And if we look at what's happening to world population, it's something that's very important. Eric said in his talk, and Eric and I regularly spar on this point, and he didn't mean anything bad by it, but he said world population will be 9.6 billion in the middle of the century, and that's what people are saying these days with the latest UN projections. I don't like to use that number because the reality is we don't know what population will be, and with things like CSE, we can have an impact on that, and that will have an impact on the Earth. So what I prefer to show, if I can find there's my laser pointer, is just really the range of possibilities that are likely for population growth this this century. These being the most likely. Demographers at the UN think there's sort of an 80% possibility or likelihood that population will be somewhere in this range between around 10 and around 12 billion. That's quite a few, considering we have 7.5 billion today, by the end of the century. Well, if CSE can help us to do this, or even beat the actuarial odds and the betters, and come down to a leveling of population in this century and then a gradual reduction of population, that won't solve all our problems, but I think it'll probably be a pretty good thing. The next slide I want to show you is where unintended pregnancy is in the world these days, region by region. Most people aren't really aware of how high unintended pregnancy is, but roughly 2 out of 5 pregnancies around the world are what I sometimes call whoops pregnancies rather than yay pregnancies. The woman involved isn't all that happy to discover that she's pregnant. Interestingly, the less developed countries have somewhat lower, that didn't work. Let's see, how did I do that? Well, I'll just have to, let's see, thank you. I've obviously pressed the wrong button here. Let's try again. If you look at the less developed countries here compared to the more developed countries, ironically enough, and this surprises many people, there's actually higher levels in the more developed countries of unintended pregnancy. North America has really the second highest level. It's around 50%. That's the United States and Canada. And then Latin America and the Caribbean has an even higher 56%. Now, eliminating unintended pregnancies probably isn't possible, and even if it could be done, it wouldn't suddenly turn around population growth, because a lot of these pregnancies sadly end in abortion, some end in miscarriage. But obviously it would have a pretty good effect on reducing, we don't know the exact number, but say half of these would be births that didn't occur. That would be a good thing for world population. So that's something we could talk about more, but that's the population side of things. There's another important pathway as well, and it's some of what I've been talking about already. By teaching the art of relating to other human beings and encouraging tolerance for individual differences, by teaching respect for the bodies of other people, understanding of our own bodies and respect for other people's bodies, and by teaching the language of consent and refusal. You're in college here, many of you, many of those watching, and you know how important this issue of yes means yes, no means no is on college campuses. Well, this is true throughout the world. It's particularly true in conflict zones. It's true everywhere, and it's true throughout life. By teaching these things, we teach a kind of citizenship skills for a century that is going to be very stressful and changing very, very rapidly. These are going to be critical citizenship skills. And in this sense, comprehensive sexuality education very much belongs, and I was glad to see that Pamela mentioned it in her talk, in this suite education that we could call character education or social and emotional learning. Some schools even combine sexuality education not only with education about the environment, but with education about population. So there's actually population curricula. They're not as big as CSE or some of the other curricula we're talking about today. But I think when you combine these things, this is a sort of a course guide offered for mostly middle schools, but also some high schools and a few elementary schools by the organization Population Connection, which has a population education program. If you could take a program and combine all the things that we talk about in this book, or many or most of them, and then add education about population's impact on the world, I think the results would be catalytic as far as both of these pathways for CSE are concerned. But can it really be for all ages? One of the things that gets to people sometimes when you talk about K through 12 CSE is they get sort of freaked out about the idea of teaching kindergartners about condoms and contraception. Well, the reality is if you wait until high school, you're way too late. There's all kinds of, as we know, teen pregnancy that occurs largely through ignorance and lack of access to reproductive health care by high school. And even in middle school, you really need to begin the preparation for sexuality and sex itself well before that. But even when you think about what's happening in kindergarten, you really need to be aware of the fact that kindergartners have things they need to learn about sexuality as well. We looked at this program around the world to try to see what some of the best, and we didn't focus so much on the worst examples. We mostly tried to see where it was happening around the world, and it is a global phenomenon. Probably the best examples we found were in the Netherlands. Happens to be a country where my daughter is living with her husband right now. And they take it very much as just part of education. It begins very much with kindergarten. And in kindergarten, what they teach is things like, how does it feel to hug someone? You know, what is physical affection like? What's it like to care for somebody? I get a kick out of it. You can't quite see it in this picture. It cuts it out, but there's actually a little bit of flirtation going on already in response to this education with this girl next to the teacher looking at a cute little boy on the far right of the screen. But it begins with things that are appropriate at that age. One thing that kindergartners need to absolutely learn is respect for bodies, and that people shouldn't be touching their own bodies unless they're parents or caregivers or very close friends or people they love. And that if someone's touching you for purely self-gratification, it's probably always wrong, at least the wrong kind of self-gratification. Children need to learn this because they're exposed to these kinds of dangers. As kids get older, they learn more about relationships. How does it feel to start to love someone? And how should you respond when you start to feel either strong affection or urges of that kind? And these are also from this school. They're slightly older. And here, too, I think we see the sort of the beginnings of respect and listening skills, as well as what may be affection, who knows. And I guess I would add, too, that the no means no issue is just so critical. We need to teach people to understand, to decide for themselves when they want to say yes and when they want to say no, to be intentional in that decision, and to actually hear that when others say it very, very clearly, and to know how to accurately respect it and to obey it when it's heard. Now let's go back to the population issue for just a second, because it relates to both of the pathways that I was talking about. Right now we have 7.5 billion people in the world, compared to the 10 or 12 that demographers expect, if we don't do much of anything about the issue, are likely to be here at the end of the century. That number is 3 times the number that were on the planet when I was born, in the middle of the 20th century. And actually the world's population when I was born is now the population of children and teenagers, amazingly enough, in the world. 2.5 billion teenagers and children around the world. The decisions those people make and are able to make, if they have the power to make the decisions for their own sexuality and their own reproduction, they're going to affect the course of population as well as behavior for the rest of the world. Each year, we know that approximately 16 million girls and women 19 years or younger around the world give birth. And having talked to quite a number of these young women and studied this phenomenon of teen pregnancy, the vast majority of these people, not all, but the vast majority, would have preferred, if they could have chosen, to have waited until they were a little older, got more education, were with a steady partner. Most of these pregnancies are not intentional. Now, on the positive side, there is growing awareness about the issue and growing interest in it all around the world, fostered in part by United Nations agencies, the World Bank, others who see the value of promoting comprehensive sexuality education around the world. Europe, especially Northern Europe, as in other areas of education, I think we've discovered working on this book, is really the leader in this area. It's way ahead of the rest of the world. It's certainly way ahead of the United States. But many developing regions are forging ahead and making commitments in this area. We have a number of examples in our chapter of somewhat surprising countries that are working very assertively on comprehensive sexuality education, from Indonesia to Kyrgyzstan to Estonia. In 2015, health and education ministers together from all of Latin America met on this specific issue, what to do about comprehensive sexuality education. And as you recall, this is the region, and this is probably one of the reasons they were concerned about the issue, this is the region that has the highest level of unintended pregnancy in the world. And they came up with a strong statement, not only about the overall concept, going this way, there we are, but this key important concept. I just realized I touched my fingers the way Donald Trump does. I don't know why. Won't do that again. This key concept that when you think about comprehensive sexuality education, and this relates to other aspects of EarthEd as well, I think, you need to bring together the services that support that education. In the case of comprehensive sexuality education, these are reproductive health and family planning services. What good does it do for people to learn about how to be safe and intentional about their sexuality if there are no health services that provide them the means and the further information how to do that? By contrast, what good is it if you have services, even if they're focused on young people, but there's no education beyond what they're getting from their peers or perhaps their culture or biases or things of that kind? It's astonishing how little this is understood around the world. Encouragingly, health and education ministers in Eastern Africa are taking the Latin American experience and they're using this as a template to develop their own concepts on comprehensive sexuality education. Disappointingly, right next door in West and Central Africa, there's nothing happening in this area. There's not even really a discussion of it. And that's the area in the world where fertility rates, unintended pregnancy rates, and worse reproductive morbidity, fistula, really bad early maternal death, all kinds of things like that, maternal death period, are highest in the world, some of which is because girls don't even go to school in a lot of these places in the numbers anything like what boys do, which is another problem we have to address and deal with in Earth education, that there are places where people are not all in school and where particular girls are not in school as much as boys are. Clearly, where girls are not in school, you're going to have some of the worst reproductive and sexual health outcomes. Now, there are plenty of obstacles. The government of Argentina developed a really good CSE program and promoted it, only to discover when they polled teachers afterwards, they should have polled the teachers first, that 60% of them had no idea how to teach CSE and were very nervous about the idea. So they began a training program for those teachers. But better to talk to your teachers first and then build your program. But the biggest problem really everywhere in the world is simple opposition. Opposition to the very idea that young people should be learning about sex at all in some places, but in schools in others. This question of should parents teach it, or maybe should nobody teach it? Should we just be keeping people ignorant about sex? Will that help? I more than think, I know the evidence shows that that is not a very wise principle to impose on education. Just as many school districts in the United States teach abstinence only, and abstinence is a legitimate thing to teach, but the federal government actually encourages and provides money for school districts to teach that it's the only way to approach sexuality. Many programs in the US and elsewhere are constrained by this idea that education on sexuality just doesn't simply belong, that it can be harmful. Colombia, another Latin American country, came up with a really good CSE program and was promoting it, and suddenly parents were marching in the streets against it, and the Catholic Church, which has a little bit of political clout in Colombia, as it does in some other countries, pressured the government to drop the program, and the government did, which is really sad. The British government just announced that they are going to begin a requirement for all schools in England, I'm not sure why just England, not Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, but maybe it's going to be tested in England, where all children 4 and older that in schools, whether they're public or private, will begin a sexuality education program, which will eventually, at the appropriate age, be teaching about sex and contraception itself. And already some parents in England are mounting, and some church leaders are mounting opposition to this. In part because they're saying this is something that really belongs with parents. You can imagine where I'm at this. My father was a great man, but he didn't really know how to handle our sexuality education. It's an effective argument because, and you know, as a parent myself, you can make the argument that this is something so intimate, so important, and so laden with values and morals that it is appropriate for parents to be the ones that teach this. I don't think there's any bright line that separates what the obligation of parents are and the rights of parents from what the obligation of schools are. But clearly we need to work on this, and we need to have open conversations about this. It's an important question and an important thing to be dealing with, and critical to young people's lives and critical to the earth. In our chapter, what we call for is transparent information when a school system is developing a program on comprehensive sexuality education, as well as fully participatory discussions about it, going the extra mile to bring all stakeholders, all parents, whether they oppose CSE or not, into the room to discuss it. Now, we call for this not only because we happen to believe, the two of us, that this is just the way self-government ought to work on any issue, but because we are so confident that when we have open discussions about comprehensive sexuality education, the way it's worked around the world, the benefits that it's had, we are confident that ultimately the strong evidence will convince everyone that it is safe, effective, healthy, and valuable. And just a couple comments that were sort of inspired by some of the earlier talks before I close. Michael had one of his principles was the real world is the optimal learning environment. I think that's generally true, but there's a different way of thinking about comprehensive sexuality education and sex itself. Similarly, Eric talked about the importance of risk on playgrounds. You want to occasionally have kids splintering their fingers on a rough piece of wood or hammering their thumbs. The real world is not the optimal learning environment when it comes to sex, because many of the decisions that are made in the world of sex are not reversible by definition, or very easily reversible in terms of one's health and one's pregnancy and one's parenting. So I think that there probably is a slight difference with comprehensive sexuality education, that it's an area where we actually want to begin education early. We want to talk about theory before we set young people out into the real world, with the hope and the conviction that as they have these, as they learn this wisdom from older people, that they will go out into the real world, a world where sex is real, where sexual violence is real and pervasive, and learn, whether they are boys or girls, how to deal with other people, how to be sexual in safe and intentional ways that make for a better world. And in that sense, comprehensive sexuality education is a fundamental and necessary part of further education. In combination with other ideas discussed in this edition of State of the World, it contributes powerfully to a happier, kinder, and more resilient world, no matter what changes we face in the rest of history. The Netherlands calls its sexuality education Lang leve de liefde, which means long live love, which I think is an appropriate way to close this talk. So thank you very much.